We are talking about how to learn a piece. How do you do it? What are the steps? That's today's topic here on Contrabass Conversations. Welcome to Contrabass Conversations, your show covering, as I like to say, life on the low end of the spectrum. I am Jason Heath, your host, and today's show is a departure, folks. You're not hearing a guest. What? No guest? Well, actually, you're hearing a lot of guests. You're hearing a few past podcast guests. I'm going to play a few excerpts, as I've done in the past for shows kind of like this, but I am taking feedback that I got through email, through Facebook, on the topic of how to learn a piece. So here's how this all got started. A South African bassist named Francis Levenderis emailed me asking, and I quote, "I am interested in writing on the creative process of how one learns a piece from beginning to end." So Francis is putting together a thesis, I think for either an undergrad or a master's, can't remember, but that was the gist of the email. And I thought, well, I could answer what I do, but as I like to do with things like this, I put it out on Facebook in the Contrabass Conversations community group. That's contrabassconversations.com/community, or just search for us on Facebook. Got a few thousand members in there, and it's a great place to bounce around topics like this. So a whole bunch of people responded, which makes me think, that's interesting. So I put it out then on the email list that we have. And if you're not on that list, go to the website, sign up. We have conversations like this. So it's pretty cool. And I got a great response. So today's episode is a combination of some of those Facebook comments and a lot of email responses and some really thoughtful responses from people all across the globe. I'd like to give a shout out to our sponsors here at Contrabass Conversations, Upton Bass String Instrument Company, D'Addario Strings, and Robertson & Sons Violins. We'll chat a bit more about them later in the episode. Francis also, once I put out this email, Francis followed up with a little bit of background. So Francis says, "I've been playing the double bass for 8 years. While I was taught technique and pieces, etc., no one ever really teaches you how to learn a piece. Once I started to learn double bass at a university level, it was emphasized a little more, but I still find that students could make great progress on pieces without much learning help from a teacher if they were told exactly what steps to take to learn a piece. Obviously, it is a creative process that one needs to develop by yourself, but as a lover of systems, I think many students could benefit from a book or brochure guiding you with steps on learning a piece." So while we are not creating, and this is Jason's words now, while we're not creating a book or brochure right now, we are kind of getting a first draft here on the podcast. What do people connected with this community we've got here, the Contrabass Conversations Army, as I like to call it, what do we think about how to learn a piece? And we're going to start with an excerpt from a fellow South African bassist, Leon Bosch. And by the way, Leon reached out to me privately and said, "Can you connect me and Francis and I'll share some of my thoughts." So Leon and Francis have been chatting, but let's listen to this quote from Leon. I've used it many times in the podcast, but it's one that really influenced the way I approach learning a piece.
I began to realize that there was something physiological taking place. Because when I started practicing, I couldn't do something, but I persevered. I would take one thing at a time and try to master it. And usually by the end of the day, I had a particular habit. I had a way in which I worked. I worked intensely for 20 minutes. And then I'd leave the room, go away and sit down, think about it, and come back to 20 minutes more. I didn't work absolutely non-stop. I had concentrated periods, but they lasted all day. And I was always in that room, the room B17, which was the bass room. And I began to realize that there was a moment where something clicked, and suddenly I could do it. And then I insisted every day that I wouldn't leave the room till something magical had happened. Something new that I couldn't do had suddenly become possible.
I can remember that morning like it was yesterday, even though it was a few years ago. As soon as I got off the line with Leon, I went out and went for a 5-mile run, which I had not been doing at that point. I was just so pumped up chatting with him. So definitely check out that full episode, contrabassconversations.com/Leon Bosch. Okay, let's dig in to some of the comments that all of you have made and the techniques that you've offered. And I'll start off with a short comment from Ron Wasserman of the New York City Ballet. But it's a great way to set the stage. Ron said, and I think this was the first comment on this topic. Ron said, I think you will get as many different answers as there are players, times the number of pieces. So that's a big number. And I did not get that many, but I got a whole heck of a lot. Here we go. Ed Maxwell writes, I have a very strict routine that never varies. Number 1, with the music in front of me, I go to YouTube or Google Play Music and listen to different recordings of the piece, playing it over and over until I know I won't get lost. Number 2, I do this with a metronome in front of me and I mark the tempos of the different movements. Number 3, if it's YouTube, I watch how the conductor conducts the piece in 2, in 4, etc. Number 4, then I look for the difficult passages and determine the fingering before touching the instrument. Can I play that section more quickly in 4th position, etc.? Number 5, then I go over the whole piece and determine fingering and bowing. Number 6, then I start to practice with the instrument. I start with a metronome setting that will allow me to play the most difficult passages and work up from there. Number 7, finally, I put my headset on and play with the professionals. Number 8, I will go back to step 1 several times if the piece is particularly difficult. The important thing as an amateur playing difficult classical music is not to get lost or to be able to find the next section. I focus on being so familiar with the music that I know where we are at all times. It gets very frustrating trying to keep up with the bass section of the Philadelphia Orchestra or New York Philharmonic, but when I get into playing with my orchestra, I'm totally in shape for it. So while those are techniques that Ed as an amateur uses, obviously those are techniques that I think a lot of us use in terms of listening and watching. You're going to hear some of these commonalities as we continue. And before we continue, I want to give a shout out to Upton Bass String Instrument Company. Eric and Gary and Jack and the whole crew over at Upton, they're good people. They're really good people, and they are making quality instruments, and they've been doing it for a long time. There are beautiful stories behind each one of their basses, whether it's the Gary Carr model or the Bostonian or whichever model they make. They are committed to serving the needs of the double bass community and each individual double bass player, and so many people play on Upton basses. It's amazing to me, chatting with Eric Rivas, chatting with Travis Book, chatting with Lucia Torino. I was chatting with Tony Monzo. Those are 4 players from completely different walks of life, yet they all play Upton basses. UptonBass.com will get you to their website, and follow them on Facebook and follow them on Instagram. I love what they do on Instagram, and they have a wonderful YouTube channel as well. So thanks for sponsoring the podcast, guys. Okay, back to our comments and thoughts. This comes from Cristóbal Caballero. Hello, Jason. First of all, excuse my English. My mother tongue is Spanish, but this comment is incredibly well written, so no worries there, Cristóbal. Cristóbal says, when I have to learn a new piece of music, the first thing I see is the title. If I listen to it before or something, then I visualize the whole to see either the most complex and the easiest passages, the tempo, the key, and clef. Then, usually I got new pieces by my teacher or in the string orchestra, so most of the time I have someone to help me out. Then it's time to play below the specified tempo, keeping in mind the bass of the subdivision. For example, in the Dragonetti Concerto, it's the 16th note at the beginning of the solo. That's the subdivision bass. And my tuning, I try in a utopian situation to play the piece from beginning to end. But most of the time, I structure the piece in different sections, in phrases, ideas, rehearsal numbers, complexity, and so on. My teacher always says to have a notebook where you can write questions to yourself and answer them, thinking methodologically. And that helps me out a lot too. Also, direct yourself as if you were the conductor in order to be correctly with the tempo and figures. After I have done this, I try to play straight, keep my posture relaxed, and my tone as I want it. I also write little notes in the score, like play more on time, listen to the pianist, or see the conductor. Next up is a comment from Dennis Bergevin, who's a past podcast guest. And Dennis writes, I almost always listen to a piece of music to inform my learning process. Studying the score, hearing recorded or live performances, and discussing the work with others all play into the total development of finally moving the learning forward. Next up is a comment from Gaelen McCormick, another former podcast guest. Gaelen plays in the Rochester Philharmonic and teaches at Nazareth College and at the Eastman Community School. Gaelen says, this is a great topic and I can't wait to see how others approach this idea. I go from large to small in this. So, number one, I look at the form, listen to the whole thing. Brand new work? Okay, I look at the whole thing, away from the bass. Do I see form, repeated ideas, variations, relationships? 2, lightly play the piece in chunks. By lightly, I mean not even trying to get the notes right. I'm going for shapes. Now is not the time to drill down for answers to what fingering, what bowing. I'm looking at the way it begins to lay on the bass, knowing I can start to address that and change that based on musical decisions. Number 3, now I'll start to get a little more detail-oriented and work from the inside out. What looked wonky, tangled, abstract? How does it fit in terms of section and form? And then what do I want to play? And where do I want to play, rather? Where do I want to play it on the bass? Now, let's drill into fingerings and bowings. 4, from there, I'll move out to the easier stuff. In some ways, everything is challenging because I want it all to sound awesome. And everything is easy because I'm going to practice it until I have the technical command to accomplish what is there. Number 5, always circling back to the big picture. Am I making music? Personally, can I really get down in the weeds and congratulate myself for nailing a fingering I worked out and almost forget that it's only a tool to accomplish the music? In the end, missing a note or biffing a fingering isn't going to matter if I was really expressing the music. So I have to remind myself that job number 1 is to keep making music, not cranking out notes. And Gaelen also, she and I serve on the International Society of Bassists Board of Directors together. And Gaelen has been running the Young Bassist program for the ISB, for the bass conventions. So very cool, Gaelen. Thank you for the comments. Next up is David Feldman, and David is assistant professor of cello and bass at Liberty University. David says, I've been exploring this idea quite a bit, out of necessity due to limited practice time, in my own life, and helping my students prioritize their time when beginning a piece. I would say that a new piece generally goes through multiple phases. The overall goal with this method is to learn a piece with rhythm, tempo, pitch, integrity, efficiently and evenly. These phases help guard against common issues of, number 1, wasting time on playable passages while neglecting difficult passages, and number 2, favoring the earlier pages or sections of a piece over the final pages or sections. Number 1, survey phase. Read through the piece under tempo but with a metronome, stopping frequently to bracket passages or sections that are not playable and need further work. Finding the correct reading tempo is important here. I would say to aim for a tempo where most of the music, at least 50%, is playable. The goal in this stage is not to fix all passages that are not playable, but just to identify them. Number 2, learning phase. For each bracketed passage, write in a good fingering or bowing that you will use each time, but always have an open mind for improved fingerings or bowings as the process continues. Find the tempo with a metronome for each one of these passages that makes it playable. Could be quarter tempo, 10th tempo, etc. of the goal tempo, and write that tempo beside the bracket. As the passage becomes better learned, this tempo marking will increase until the reading tempo from the survey phase is met. At that point, the bracket can be removed. Practice the bracketed spots until all are removed. Number 3, goal tempo phase. At this point, everything in the piece is playable at the survey phase, metronome marking. It would now be time to raise the overall tempo until you reach the final goal tempo. Putting the old bracketed spots in the larger context might be the most difficult aspect of this stage. In this specific method, I've obviously not taken into account the more musical aspects of learning a piece, but a similar method could be used with a focus on tone, phrasing, etc. Ideally, everyone will find a way to incorporate many different methods or modes of practicing to solve many different types of problems. Next up, we have an excerpt from my interview with Diana Gannett, and Diana is, of course, the past bass professor emeritus at the University of Michigan, fantastic player and teacher and pedagogue. Definitely listen to our interview. If you haven't, it's a deep dive into teaching, contrabassconversations.com/Diana Gannett. And here's a clip about what Gary Carr did in terms of fingerings and bowings and how that incorporated into her teaching.
Writing in Gary called it mapping. I got it from him. You have to write in your fingerings and bowings. He made us do it. We all hated it. And I learned so much doing it, because you go, oh, this is what I'm going to do. Oh, this is brilliant. You go back the next day and you go, what was I thinking? But you begin to find out what's in tune for your hand and different kinds of shifting. Oh, this sounds cool and that doesn't, and you don't bother to think about it unless you make yourself. And having a pencil in hand is a good way to make yourself think about it. Gary could sit on an airplane and, take a new piece, do all the bowings and fingerings, and that's all he would, that's the way he would do it. Then on, and that's the way he would perform it. I just couldn't do that. I have to keep changing my mind. But it's good to have that starting point. And it's an easy thing for students to let go of. And it's a hard thing as a teacher to keep insisting on it all the time. But one of the nice things about it is that when they have everything written in, I can pick up my bass and then play what they've decided and make suggestions, Plus, it gives me an opportunity to play for them, which is, I think, one of the best ways for people to learn.
I'd like to take a moment and also thank our sponsor, D'Addario Strings. They make great strings. I've got Kaplans on my bass, and I've used Helicors in the past. I've used Zyx in the past, and I really dig the responsiveness and the tonal variation. In terms of their Helicor strings, if you are looking for a hybrid string that works well for both jazz and orchestra, or you're looking for a straight-up orchestra string or a jazz pizzicato string, Helicor is a great option. I've used Helicor off and on for, 20 years at least. I have a lot of students that use them. They're a high-quality string. They're at a great price point. And check them out. We got a link in the show notes. And thank you so much for sponsoring the podcast, D'Addario. Next up, we have Marcel Villaflor, the ISB treasurer, serves on the board with me too, and just a brilliant guy. Here's what Marcel says in terms of learning a piece. I suppose there are many thoughts on this. For me, I approach learning doing these things. Number one, I listen to as many versions of the piece as I can, not with the bass or bass part. Instead, I use the score while first listening to the work. This gives me an idea of what the other instruments are playing. It helps identify what to listen for prior to each bass entrance. It also allows me to know which bass lines are primary or supporting voices. Number two, I mark up the bass part with all the important things I've learned while listening to the work with the score. Number three, I listen to the work with the bass part in hand. Number four, I listen to many versions of the work and identify the points where variation of interpretation or retards occur. I mark these measures with eyeglasses to look at the conductor. I often memorize those passages so I can watch the conductor continuously. Number five, I pick up the bass and work the hardest passages first at reduced speed. I check out different fingerings and bowings. Number six, once these tough passages are practiced, I attack the work backwards from end to beginning. I find I get a satisfaction of completing something when I can play to the end, no matter from where I started. Number seven, during the above, I call other bass friends I've met at ISB conventions to find out what they do, their fingerings, bowings, and breathing. Next up is a series of questions, really, from David Goodwin. This is very cool. David writes, before I begin working on a new piece, I play through it. I listen to it if there are recordings. Then I ask questions. Is this something I would enjoy working on or performing? Is it within my technical ability? If not, will my technical ability grow with this piece to a point that I can play it? What will or can I learn from this piece? Is the music worth the time it will take to bring it to a performance level? If the answer is no to any of the above questions, then do I have to play this? Orchestral or chamber work, or someone else chose it? Now, in terms of working on it, play through it again and identify troublesome spots. Are those spots problematic for right hand, left hand, or both? Decide on bowings, decide on fingerings. Systematically work through difficult areas at a tempo I can play with zero mistakes, one at a time before moving on. Revisit those excerpts daily while working new sections. After rhythm, notes, fingering, shifting, string crossing, and bowing are consistent, work on the music. For me, this includes everything on the page that is not dots and lines, and things that are not on the page at all. Style, tempo, dynamics, phrasing, portamento, vibrato, bow speed, string contact point, arm weight. Next up, David Hayes, another podcast guest, contrabassconversations.com/David Hayes. He is, of course, the founder and owner of Recital Music. You've probably played a lot of pieces from David's company over the years. David writes, don't always start at the beginning. Sometimes start at the end. Sometimes start in the middle, like a jigsaw. Put the pieces together until the picture begins to emerge. Works every time with my students. We're seeing some themes here, right? Aren't we, folks, as we go through these? Next up is James Lambert from the Cincinnati Symphony, and James has a lot of period music playing as well. James writes, first, I spend some time studying it without the instrument so that I can mentally hear the music and form a concept of the piece without the impediment of the instrument and its technical issues. Once I have a good idea of how I want the music to sound, then I take the instrument and let my musical concept guide me in putting the piece together. I let my choice of fingerings, bowings, etc. be guided by my musical concept. And Kurt Muroki, who is the bass professor, or one of the bass professors at Indiana University, and is hosting, he's the host site, Indiana University is the host site for the 2019 ISB convention. So we'll be hearing a lot from Kurt coming up. But Kurt writes, start with one note, then two, then three, then four, always going back to the beginning. Once you get to the end, then start on the second note and play through till the end. Then start on the third note, then the fourth, etc. You can learn a concerto in a few days. Patience and persistence. Quality versus quantity of repetition. There is a poster we could all put on our walls, right? Kurt, by the way, is a past podcast guest, one of the first people I had on when I restarted the podcast in 2015. And the next comments come from another podcast guest, Paul Cannon, who plays with Ensemble Moderne. And Paul writes, everybody has their own process. Some people are completely methodical, others intuitive. A colleague of mine described learning the Ligeti Piano Concerto. He said the third movement lasts 4 minutes, but is so difficult it requires 4 days at first to read through it once. From there, it's simply a matter of reducing 4 days' time to 4 minutes. That's a great line. I love that. And Paul goes on to say, another colleague, a clarinetist, said something similar. He claimed once he could play a passage correctly at a very slow tempo. Getting up to speed was trivial. And let's hear a clip from Paul. We talked a lot in our interview about just learning modern music in general. So here's a bit from Paul on how to work on modern music, how to approach modern music. How can the rest of us better prepare new music? And I think about that all the time when I get a piece that's just like, I don't even know where to start. So like that setting a timer, maybe like 5 minutes per measure to learn the moves. That's something you've done. What else?
That's one way. Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of different ways. I think it really depends on what the piece is. Yeah. What's the point? What's the challenge? With Valentine, the main challenge is actually just understanding the notation. Okay. The playing itself, I don't find especially difficult at this point. It is a hard piece, but once you've gotten over that hurdle of understanding the notation and being able to do the moves, it's okay. There's other pieces where it's much more about the rhythm, for example, and that's usually best solved with a metronome. There's a lot of things I've actually put into MIDI just to play along with a click track and even possibly a MIDI sound just for intonation. I did that with Elliott Carter's Figment. That works really well. The challenge with the figments is understanding the rhythm first, and then also getting all of this atonal stuff in tune. Once you're able to do that with the computer, you can throw the computer away and work more on phrasing and color and the actual musical side of it. But I needed that kind of technical basis to move forward.
I'd like to also give a shout out to our third and final sponsor, Robertson and Sons Violins. They've been active for over 40 years selling instruments. You've seen them at the International Society of Bassists Convention, surely if you've been there before. And wow, if you have not been to Albuquerque and visited the Robertson & Sons shop, you got to go. It's amazing. They have a concert hall where you can try out instruments. How cool is that? They have 3 showrooms filled with instruments, and one of them is completely basses, nothing but basses. I was playing on basses from the 18th century. I was like a kid in a candy store. It was completely amazing. And they've got a lot for sale right now, from student level basses all the way up to the most incredible basses you're ever going to see. So definitely check them out, robertsonviolins.com. And thanks for sponsoring the podcast, guys. Next up, we have a comment from Paul Sanwald, who's a San Francisco-based jazz artist. He and I have gotten the chance to hang out in the past. Paul writes, since most of what I need to learn for gigs is in the jazz realm, here's my process for learning jazz standards. 1. Select reference recordings. I recently wanted to learn Everything Happens to Me, so I listened to recordings by Chet Baker, Warren Marsh, also Ella Fitzgerald. Number 2, key. What are the common keys people play this tune in? The point of this is to determine if I should practice it in all keys or if everyone plays it in the same key, like Wayne Shorter tunes, but no one ever switches the key for those. Number 3, learn to sing the melody. Identify the arc of the song. Number 4, learn the harmony and identify any differences. In Everything Happens to Me, there are several ways people get back to the 2 chord. Also listen for and learn any alternate changes that people use on this tune. Number 5, pick up the bass. Play through the harmony along with the recordings. Identify mistakes or anything that went wrong in step number 4. Number 6, for the melody, decide what range to use and if you'll employ any octave jumps to accommodate the range of the bass. Number 7, bow the melody. Identify problem spots either technically, hard bowing or position shift, or musical, not hearing a phrase correctly. If it's a difficult tune, write out the melody and write down fingerings and or bowings. Next up, we have Martin Zuinglio. Oh boy, I bet I pronounced that wrong. Zuinglio. Apologies, Martin. Martin writes, in my case, I just read the part, read it again, sing the notes. Try to figure out the duration and timing, try to hit the notes with the beat, and then I try to read and play simultaneously. My teacher told me that reading must bear out the execution. Next up, we have Peggy Johnston of the San Diego Symphony. I played with Peggy many years ago at this point in the Brit Festival in Oregon. Peggy writes, since I am primarily an orchestral player, I will tell you simply how I learn an orchestral piece I have never played. First, I listen to a recording, often easy to find on YouTube, except for some new music selections. In that case, the orchestra conductor or manager might send a link to a non-orchestrated version. I sit with the part and look for patterns or any weird anomalies that might take special attention, like complex rhythms. I follow the part with the recording. Then I start the practicing and get the feel of the piece, so I get an idea of how to pace my energy. Repetition of difficult passages works for me, and I imagine everyone. Slow practice is a must. Next up, we have Nathan May. Nathan writes, my process for learning a new piece is pretty simple. Number 1, listen to the piece until you can sing it from memory. Number 2, finger the piece with some first draft fingerings and first draft bowings. Number 3, begin playing slowly through the whole piece, making note of the sections where fingerings and bowings need to be reworked. Number 4, schedule myself out. Ensure through planning that I see the piece several times each week before the next lesson or performance. Number 5, revise fingerings until you have something that will work in every section. Number 6, practice those fingerings that are unfamiliar away from the piece until they feel natural. And a couple more comments here. This next one is from Sharif Ibrahim of the Atlanta Symphony. And Sharif writes, my learning process begins away from the instrument and starts with the score or the part. I like to imagine that to master something, it takes no less than 4 weeks if you can work on it diligently every day for 2 hours. I split my efforts into 3 stages where I set clear mental goals for myself. Therefore, I do not waste time with my instrument in my hands. Part 1. Identify overall technical issues and question everything. Is it lyrical? Is a seamless legato my main concern? Where can a shift be heard? When can it not be heard? Where are the peaks? Where are the valleys? Why is this section harder than another? What pieces have I worked on that are similar to this? If I work on those pieces, will they help me with this one? This is my usual thought process, and I use it for every solo, excerpt, or whatever. I find it helpful to think about what you're going to do before you do it, rather than just starting at the beginning and trying to play it. Every time I do that, I sound like crap and get frustrated. Haven't we all been there? I find it helpful to identify one or more climax and work on phrasing away from the bass. That way, when I begin practicing, I already know what I want to say, so I only have to focus on execution. If you have access, listen to recordings by phenomenal musicians. What would Heifetz do? It doesn't have to be the exact piece, but a piece in the style or something from the period. Part 2 can take 1 day or 3 years, depending on difficulty and dedication. Work slowly at different tempos. Depending on your time frame, it might be useful to start a passage at half tempo, then work it up to 80% in 20 minutes. I do this for most simple passages. Every time I think I've made progress, I raise my standards. If time is not an issue and I do not have to perform this piece in the foreseeable future, then I aim to make the technical execution as seamless as possible. Part 3. Performance practice. Even if you are not ready, play the piece for people you respect. Having a good mentor is useful, but they often get caught up in more teaching dogma than your peers will. If there is a set performance date, perform your piece once a day for someone and record it. Listen to it that night or the next morning, then take your criticism and repeat step 2. I believe this is a cyclical process that never ends. Next up, we have Danielle Meyer, and she writes, in regard to your question about learning songs, tunes, parts, etc., for me, it is different for each style and type of ensemble. First, my limited classical experience, which is what I'm really enjoying the most of the last 2 years and where I have the most work to do. I am adequate at sight reading music, but I find it really helps for me to hear a really great recording of whatever piece I am learning. For example, I've just started working on the Fuchs B-flat Sonata right now, which is at the limits of my very amateur attempts as a contrabass soloist. I am listening to recordings of the piece performed by Joel Quarrington over and over. It helps my mind and ear to know what is coming next, which allows me to play with far more confidence. This leads to better tone and intonation far earlier in the learning process than if I'm learning a piece by reading alone. That helps keep me from getting frustrated and giving up. First, I just listen to the piece a lot. I really find value in listening to the recording and reading the part without my bass. After that, I play along with those recordings in their entirety between rehearsals. I started doing that in Youth Symphony when I was a kid 25 years ago. We played Beethoven's Fourth, and I checked out the record from our library. Not only did it help me learn the part, it was fun to play along with the Chicago Symphony Orchestra in my room after school. Next up, we have Joshua Henry Endo, and he writes, what I do, number 1, sight read the piece from start to finish. Number 2, I break it into phrases, labeling it A, B, C. Number 3, if I have difficulty in the passage, I take an etude with similar technique of the passage and study it until I get the technique I want for the passage. Number 4, now I focus on the tone I want for each passage, repeating step 2. Number 5, now I practice the entire piece again. Next up, we have Chantal Incandela, and I don't think we've actually ever met Chantal, but I feel like we know each other really well. We've corresponded a lot over the years. And Chantal writes, when I learn a new piece, I try to first get the background on it. When was it written? For whom was it written? What are the composer's thoughts, ideas, inspiration on it, etc.? If there's a recording of it, I try to listen to a few as well. I try to learn as much as I can about it away from my instrument first before diving in with my bass. Next up, we have Peter Tambroni, longtime friend from the Chicago area, one of my first podcast guests and a repeat visitor to the show. Peter writes, "Don't start at the beginning." We've heard that many times, haven't we? Find the most difficult spot and figure it out so you don't keep hitting a roadblock. Make the most difficult spot into warm-up exercises so you work on them every day you begin a practice session. Work on difficult passages, creating a scaffolding or checkerboard effect so you can easily fill in gaps with easier passages. If you start working on your solo at the beginning, also work backward, the last 4 measures, last 8, etc., so the entire piece is learned evenly. I often work on phrases throughout the piece, working in from the ends. Practice slowly, very slowly. Painfully slowly. So slow, it becomes easy and correct every time you play it. Don't practice mistakes. Make a game out of difficult spots by having a scientist mind. What experiment can I do to play this how I want? Listen to the piece. A lot, way more than you think. And let's hear an excerpt from Pete. We had an episode called Tips for Teachers, again, probably back in 2015, maybe early 2016. But here is Pete on the topic of learning a piece.
Repetition without brain involvement is you're wasting your time.
Right, or you're practicing and reinforcing the wrong thing.
Exactly.
Even worse, yeah.
So repetition with active engagement. Active engagement is what you want.
Yeah. Our last set of thoughts for this episode comes from Ayrian Yasar, who writes, "How to learn a piece of music by memory depends much on personal ability. The better your ear, often the easier to learn new pieces. In the beginning, you are working on basics, rhythm, intonation, dynamics. If you have trouble with rhythm, counting out loud or clapping, while seeming rudimentary, can really help. Also, playing with a metronome to make sure you are keeping a steady beat is invaluable. Listening to your piece played by an artist is also helpful at this stage. When I was trying to memorize a piece, I would just play it repeatedly until I started feeling comfortable with it as a whole. This usually happens when you have a pretty good understanding of the rhythm and flow of the piece. Then I would play small sections, maybe just a measure, a few times while looking at the music, then try to play the section without looking. If I could do it by memory, I would add the next measure. Then I would play the next measure, reading music, if I thought I needed to, then try to link it to the first measure without looking. Gradually, I would link more and more measures together. This takes a good deal of time, and I dare say I wasn't consistent with the rigor of it the whole way through, but it definitely helps if you are struggling to remember a passage. My teacher used to ask her students to copy from memory their music. While I wasn't able to do it very well, the practice of writing out the music on manuscript paper is probably more helpful for visual learners. For myself personally, when I wrote out a section, even if I had to look at the music, I at least knew I had looked at that part in some detail. For people who worry about blanking out and not remembering a piece of music, the writing of it from memory would probably help, since you aren't relying as much on kinesthetic knowledge, but actually knowing more independently what you are playing. Use your ears. Listening to recordings of your piece helps learning it as well. If you can hear how the melody of a piece goes, the more easily you will be able to find all the notes you need and be able to play it. Also, listening to artists play your piece gives you more ideas on how to interpret the music. You may disagree with their interpretation, but then you can form your own ideas. Those are our comments. I'm so grateful for everybody who wrote in, and I want to offer a few book recommendations if you'd like to read more about this. 3 books that I've gotten a lot out of are The Art of Practicing by Madeline Bruiser, The Inner Game of Music by Barry Green, of course, past podcast guest and a well-known figure in the bass world, and The Musician's Way by Gerald Glickstein. Those are 3 books that have really helped me think about practicing and learning a piece specifically, and I would love any recommendations you have. Send me a message, feedback at Contrabass Conversations. Let me know another book on this topic or an article or any sort of resource, and I'll make sure to share it out to the community. And speaking of community, Isn't this episode a perfect example of the power of the Contrabass Conversations Army coming together to share knowledge and experience? I love projects like these. I hope you enjoyed this. And if you have any other ideas along these lines, I would just so appreciate it. Let me know. Feedback at Contrabass Conversations, and just share those ideas. That would mean so much to me. Contrabass Conversations is produced by Michael Cooper and Steve Hinchy, our audio editors, Mitch Mooring, our audio engineer, Trevor Jones, publication and promotion, and I am your host, Jason Heath, coming to you from beautiful San Francisco, California. That's going to do it for today's episode, and we will see you again soon for more life on the low end of the spectrum.